Our justice system is broken. Since the 1980s, after the civil rights movement, when the United States government took a hardline stance against drug use, our ethnic discrimination has transformed from segregation to perpetuating poverty cycles for minorities by locking up their family members. We are locking up low-income minorities at alarming rates. 65% of our prison population is made up of African Americans and Hispanics, despite them making up just 28% of our country's populations. Today, about half of all incarcerated individuals committed non-violent drug offenses, mostly from low-income minority neighborhoods. We are here to discuss how our country's stance against drugs has enabled racist policymakers to maintain an impoverished minority class, as 1 in 3 black males will serve time in prison today, compared to 1 in 17 white males.
While your American Studies class has discussed America's response to the drug crisis, we feel it is especially relevant for the class to review the aftermath of the war on drugs, mass incarceration. Most of our U.S. history this year has revolved around race in America, from discussing the modern-day implications of slavery to racism influencing our daily lives. But the structurally biased criminal justice system that perpetuates our present-day cycle of poverty among minorities has been little discussed. Current issues revolving around mass incarceration exemplify the fact that racial divide is present not only through explicit discrimination, but in the subtle nuances of the judicial system and the legal penalties surrounding them. Since 1980, the percentage of the American public that is incarcerated has been tripled. Jails have operated at an average of 91% capacity since 2000, creating unsustainable budgets while denying economic prosperity to low-income communities of the incarcerated. It is essential that we integrate the origins and present-day ramifications of mass incarceration into the American Studies curriculum by learning how our current model for criminal punishment is biased against minorities in the lower class by failing to bring justice and rehabilitate. In 2011 and 2015, 17,000 people were jailed because they couldn't afford bail of $5,000 or less. In fact, 90% of people stuck in jail are there because they couldn't afford bail. Bail disadvantages black Americans specifically, mainly because of the disparity in drug-related offenses and low income. For example, African American men in jail have an average income 64% lower than non-incarcerated African Americans. Bail rates also are arbitrary, as they aren't guided by national standards. Each jurisdiction differs on how they set bail, and many are pulled from thin air, with no respect to how much a person can afford. An inability to pay the money bail may coerce people to plead guilty so that they can get out of jail sooner, despite being innocent. Getting out of jail can mean saving that person's job, keeping custody of their children, and being able to get their affairs in order for the trial. Since low-income people are less likely to afford bail, the bulk of America's jail population is made up of people whose incarceration stems from being poor. A particular issue that disproportionately affects low-income citizens and minorities is unattainable bail. Bail is when a defendant is released from jail in exchange for money that the court holds until the trial is complete, ensuring the defendant appears in court so they don't lose their bail money. This allows people to get out of jail while waiting weeks or months for the trial, but that costs a lot. 62% of people currently in jail aren't serving time, but are waiting for trial. Most of these people are already at a monetary disadvantage before they are even arrested, making bail less affordable for low-income citizens. Current issues revolving around mass incarceration exemplify the fact that racial divide is present not only through explicit discrimination, but in the subtle nuances of the judicial system and the legal penalties surrounding them. Since 1980, the percentage of the American public that is incarcerated has tripled.
Our justice system is broken. Since the 1980s, after the civil rights movement, when the U.S. government took a hardline stance against drug use, our ethnic discrimination has transformed from segregation to perpetuating modern poverty cycles for minorities by locking them up. We are locking up low-income minorities at alarming rates. 65% of our prison population is made up of African Americans and Hispanics, despite them making up just 28% of our country's population. Politicians on the state and federal level during the 80s and 90s, but somewhat continuing to the 2000s and 2010s, have had a particular legislative focus on imprisoning people for using drugs most popular with minorities. We've locked up millions of citizens with racist legislation targeted to imprison blacks and Hispanics while failing to curb the crisis of addictive drugs on our streets. Today, about half of all incarcerated individuals committed non-violent drug offenses, mostly from low-income minority neighborhoods. We are here to discuss today how our country's stance against drugs and against crime as a whole recently has enabled racist policymakers to maintain an impoverished minority class. 1 in 3 black males today will serve time in prison, compared to 1 in 17 white males.
University and the American Economic Review conducted a study and found people in jail are significantly more likely to plead guilty, typically because it's the fastest track to getting home. By design, plea bargains are supposed to be a way of avoiding lengthy, costly trials for defendants who are clearly guilty. Instead, they've become a way for low-income people to get out of jail as quickly as possible, even if it means pleading guilty to a crime they didn't commit. 11.6% of plea bargains are wrongful convictions. Since the beginning of the war on drugs and crime, plea deal levels have skyrocketed. In the 1960s, around 1/3 of felony charges led to trial. Now just 1/20th of felony cases go to trial. 97% of federal felony convictions are a result of plea bargains. Today, many people plead guilty without knowing the evidence against them, even when not guilty.
Once a trial date is set, if a suspect is unable to afford bail, then they typically can't afford a counsel either, and are issued a public defender, which in theory is a taxpayer-funded attorney who wholly defends their clients. But a strong majority of public defenders lack the appropriate legal funds and are too overworked to bring positive results to their clients. Given the socioeconomic makeup of the most impoverished suspects in the legal system, public defenders mainly represent Black and Hispanic clients, who are the most in-need ethnic demographics for competent legal aid. The New York Times has found that the average high-level felony, the murderers, the arsonists, you get the gist trials, only receive a few hours, 9 to 10 hours on average, of trial work from their public defenders altogether. This consists of court hearings, document preparation, and all the other tasks which a lawyer has to complete for a trial to defend their client competently. This is nearly impossible. Federal guidelines outlining the work required to adequately defend a high-level felony suggest a minimum of 50 hours. But this isn't even limited to extreme crimes. Every kind of crime, on average, has public defenders spending far less time on their cases than suggested. Though this isn't out of a lack of caring. These shortcomings are mainly because public defenders' offices' budgets are stretched far too thin. Public defenders are assigned massive caseloads, where they're being paid less than half of what their private sector counterparts are making. So across the nation, a handful of public defenders are handling the vast bulk, 85% of all criminal cases. In New Orleans, just 60 attorneys are handling 20,000 cases each year. Nationwide, the average public defender has 100 cases at any given time. And in one extreme example, the New York Times discovered that a public defender's office in Louisiana had covered hundreds of cases in one day, with one lawyer covering 413 felonies in one day. He did the work of 10 lawyers by spending a mere minutes with each of his clients. This is unhealthily high, leading to public defenders wanting to rush through their cases just to represent all of their clients. Even the American Bar Association, the organization which licenses attorneys, has called this system a mockery to the American constitutional right of reasonable counsel. This is in blatant violation of the civil rights that each American is entitled to, as when public defenders have a high caseload like this, they have no choice but to pressure their clients to take the easy and convenient way out to resolve their cases as quickly as possible: plea bargains. So to force their clients' hands, they put in the fear of unreasonable mandatory minimums over their heads. For the cases that do make it to trial, mandatory minimums have come into existence as a result of the war on drugs. With public furious about lethal drugs flooding the streets and supposedly harming their children, politicians on the state and federal level, beginning in the 80s but continuing again up until now, have introduced harsh mandatory sentencing that forces judges to hand down strict penalties with no flexibility for the circumstances of the crime. Drug offenses today make up 45% of all convicts. These penalties are inherently structured to lock up minorities and maintain a white-controlled socio-political sphere. For example, with crack and powder cocaine. While they are chemically identical, the same substance, the penalties are extremely disparate. Possession of just 5 grams of crack cocaine, which is mainly used in the African American community, carries an automatic mandatory minimum of 5 years. However, it takes 500 grams of powder cocaine, a drug mainly fancied by affluent whites, to achieve the same penalty. That is 100-time difference in quantity, a massive bias. Now, the Obama administration did fortunately pass a Fair Sentencing Act, which reduces this bias. However, critics have pointed out that it still takes 18 times the amount of powder cocaine to achieve the same sentence as that amount of crack. This bias has led to blacks making up 80% of defendants in court for drug charges, while they only make up 7.8% of users, as the criminal system has put additional emphasis on catching and locking up crack cocaine users, among other drugs. Though these racist penalties are across the board, mandatory minimums have been targeted against African Americans for almost all drugs. The ACLU has found that the average black drug offense carries the same sentence as the average white violent offense. That is insane. And so, While we here can't support drug use in any way, this is a clear evolution of segregationist policy targeted to keep minorities going through the prison poverty intergenerational cycle. As once these drug users who need treatment, not discipline, are released back into society, they face barriers after concrete barriers to live a normal life.
Reintegration into society is not only a challenge for former prisoners, but for the communities they occupy. Even people locked up for minor drug offenses feel the true pain of incarceration once they are released. Nearly 95% of all inmates in the US will eventually be released, and 650,000 are released every year. But over half of all prisoners are sent back to jail within 3 years of their release. A study from the Urban Institute found that less than 50% of people released from jail are able to find a job upon returning to civilian life. Most prisoners return to the communities that they came from, which in many cases are impoverished and crime-ridden. Inmates are homeless at 11 times the rate of the general population, as most landlords refuse to accept felons as tenants. Additionally, many employers are reluctant to trust hiring criminals, and as a result, 50% become unemployed after being released, and around 95% report earning less than $25,000. This has all contributed to 64% of convicts having a mental illness or an addiction to controlled substances. Many of these criminals are mothers and fathers, playing a significant role in raising the next generation of their neighborhood. A Brookings Institute study has revealed that incarceration leads to proportionally higher child poverty rates and lower college enrollment rates. Millions of Black and Hispanic men and women are being locked up for petty offenses by a system rigged to ensure they remain poor, all while costing taxpayers billions.
Our current culture of mass incarceration is a cancerous tumor on the growth of our society and a roadblock to minority socioeconomic mobility. Prison has been ingrained as a part of life in many African American and minority communities. The University of Pennsylvania has found that it has distorted social norms of the affected communities by normalizing crime and imprisonment to adults and young children alike. Mass incarceration dehumanizes poor and minority people in the eyes of the media and the public, damaging already marginalized communities and using up public funds while doing little to advance our common goal of public safety. We have found this is disenfranchising millions of Americans by permanently withholding social mobility and prosperity from most. Mass incarceration plays a critical role in the lives of many, but is an often undiscussed issue in the bubble that is the wealthy, homogeneous North Shore. Additionally, given the time we have spent most of our year learning about American history through the lens of race in America, we feel this is a particular issue that's often undiscussed but relevant to our curriculum. It will open up many Socratic-style discussions, of which we've enjoyed many throughout the year, while allowing students to reflect on how our current justice system is flawed.